It was a rather innocent beginning. I was left her Ashwood, Pennsylvania home by my Aunt Cordelia, a lady whose peculiarities outnumbered her antique teacups. The name she gave it was Ashwood Manor. Located on a vast, overgrown yard, this magnificent Victorian home is only a little bit run down. For me, a struggling writer crammed into a tiny Brooklyn flat, it was a blessing. An opportunity to go away from the hustle and bustle of the city and complete my manuscript in solitude. I had no idea that tranquility would be the very last thing I would encounter. The journey from New York was lengthy and devoid of incident. The sun was sinking when I got at Ashwood, and the long, haunting shadows it formed over the grand front of the mansion were unsettling. The keys were delivered to me by the real estate agent Thaddeus, an anxious guy. His fingers shook slightly. "Good luck, Mr. Hawthorne," he stutter-spoken, avoiding making eye contact. You'll need IIT." I wrote off his anxiety as a product of his rural upbringing. The home needed a new coat of paint, but it was ancient and maybe a touch frightening. The first few days were devoted to unpacking and adventuring. The house was a maze of twisting halls, chambers cluttered with long-lost possessions, and chandeliers hung with spider webs. In the library's leather-bound volumes, I discovered Aunt Cordelia's diaries, which had her spidery handwriting. She detailed the house's history and the enigmatic disappearance of the Ashwood family, its original owners, who had lived there for centuries. Just 1 week after I settled there, the first disturbing event happened. Late into the night, my fingers pounding rhythmically on the keyboard were the only sounds in the study. A woman's voice, barely audible above the sound of background noise, seemed to be emanating from the walls. I strained my ears and ceased to type. Because of how quietly it said "get out," I almost thought it was all in my head. I attributed it to the wind blowing through the holes in the walls and the ancient home settling. However, the hushed murmurs persisted, becoming both more frequent and more forceful. They would hiss, "Leave," and sometimes you could hear the sound of footsteps reverberating through deserted chambers. I became so frightened of the ancient house's creaks and groans that I began to sleep with the lights on. As the sun went down, I ventured into the attic, a huge, dusty room brimming with long-lost artifacts from the Ashwood family. I found a closed trunk whose metal surface was moist and chilly. I pushed it open out of sheer curiosity, my rising discomfort taking a back seat. Within, I discovered a set of fragile antique pictures that had begun to fade. I was really drawn to one shot. A frail young lady with wide, terrified eyes and a pale, emaciated face was seen in it. Fading ink spelled out only one word: Eleanor. By nightfall, the murmurs had grown louder. "Eleanor," they growled repeatedly. I stayed up all night. In the midst of the spine-tingling murmurs, I paced the floor. A chilling, stifling weight washed over me as I sensed an eerie presence inside the home. In my pursuit of details on Eleanor Ashwood, I visited the Neighborhood Historical Society first thing the next morning. Mrs. Peabody, the librarian, a gentle lady, recognized the name right away. "Eleanor Ashwood," she whispered. Over a century and a half ago, she vanished without a trace. There are rumors that she was killed, and her corpse is stashed away someplace in the mansion. With this terrifying new knowledge in hand, I made my way back to the mansion, my anxiety rising with each step. I had to get out of there, away from Eleanor Ashwood's stifling influence and the walls that spoke in my ear. Whispers became more agitated and loud as I gathered my belongings. "Please don't leave," they begged. "Stay with us." With my pulse racing, I paid them no mind. Ashwood Manor was a sight to see as I sped away from it, its grand facade cast in shadow by the waning light. From one of the top windows, I thought I caught a glimpse of a pale face staring down at me, with big eyes filled with a strange, unsettling grief. I continued on my journey without turning around. No, I never went back. And the muted murmurs reverberate in the recesses of my consciousness even now. Story 2. A man of the road, my grandpa Silas drove trucks. He has traversed this nation on foot on many occasions and saw things that would astound the average person. On a rainy day, he recounted the tale to me in a low, gravelly voice, his eyes far away, as if reliving the memory. He mentioned the summer of 1978. He was traveling alone down the famed Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles with a hefty cargo of goods. He noticed her in the middle of the barren Mojave Desert as the sun set, casting a rainbow of oranges and purples over the sky. A young lady, her thumb extended, stands on the roadside. Her black hair was tied back in a ponytail, and she wore trousers and a worn denim jacket. She seemed weary and exposed. A good-hearted guy like Silas couldn't abandon her in the vast expanse of emptiness. The quiet of the desert was broken only by the sound of his motor as he drew. Over. With the window rolled down, he said, "Where you headed?" "Flagstaff," she whispered in response. "My name is Willow." Silas motioned to the seat next him and gave a subtle nod. With an outpouring of gratitude, Willow got in. While they were on the road, the only sounds were the engine's hum and the CB radio's crackle. Willow introduced herself as a student who was traveling the nation via hitching. When they were almost to Needles, California, Silas saw that Willow was shaking. Offering her the blanket he had stashed beneath his seat, he grabbed for it. Murmuring, "Thanks," she gathered the blanket about her shoulders. The huge, desolate desert expanse stretched out before them as they kept driving. Observing that Willow had slept off, Silas cast a quick peek in her direction. Thinking of his own granddaughter, who was about Willow's age, made him grin. After driving for a while, Silas finally stopped at a truck stop in Kingman, Arizona, to eat and refuel. Willow had already gone when he turned to wake her. No longer there. Crumbled on the bench was the blanket he'd given her, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. Silas didn't know what to do. No sign of Willow could be found when he searched the whole vehicle, including the cab, the bed, and the area around it. At the restaurant, he inquired as to whether the waitress had seen a young lady who matched Willow's description. However, she declined, shaking her head. No one had seen anyone. The odd absence of Willow troubled Silas's thoughts as he resumed his trek, shaken and bewildered. He stopped at a restaurant on his way to Flagstaff a few days later, in the hopes of getting some answers. The waitress was a middle-aged lady with sympathetic eyes. He told her about Willow. Paleness spread over the waitress's face. "Willow," she said, her voice quivering. "That's my daughter, you know. It has been 5 years since she was killed in a vehicle accident on this exact roadway. There was a little cemetery outside of town that the waitress took Silas to. In the midst of the worn tombstones, one could see a gravestone that said Willow Creek. The waitress's account was corroborated by the dates found on the headstone. 5 years to the day after Silas had picked her up, Willow had passed away on the same roadway. The hitchhiker on Route 66 was an experience that Silas would never forget. He recounted the tale to me many times, his voice always tinged with amazement and fear. Following that incident, he said he would never again pick up a hitchhiker. And he made it a habit to carry an extra blanket in his vehicle in case Willow needed it. Story 3. Approximately 10 years ago, this event took place in my life. Exploring abandoned sites was something that Jasper, my buddy, and I were fascinated with doing. The abandoned toy shop on Elm Street was the most fascinating of all of them, and our tiny town of Havenwood, Maine had its fair share of them. There were ancient mills, empty farmhouses, and other abandoned buildings. Years had passed since the business had been shuttered, and the paint on its walls and windows had begun to peel. There were rumors going around about it, including tales of a dissatisfied owner who disappeared without a trace, and tales of unusual sounds emanating from within the building throughout the night. Through a combination of teenage bravado and a need for excitement, Jasper and I made the decision to conduct an investigation. We were able to sneak into the toy shop via a broken window in the rear on a hot summer day. We were equipped with flashlights and a fair dose of apprehensive excitement. The only sound that could be heard emanating from the inside was the creaking of the floors under our boots. The air inside was heavy with dust. The shelves were still crammed with toys, including rusted toy cars, dusty dolls, and board games that were missing parts. The experience was like going back in time. While we were exploring the shop, our headlights cut through the darkness, exposing forgotten places that were packed with cobwebs and shadows. We discovered a stack of cartons that had not been opened in the rear room. Within the building, we came upon a collection of old marionettes, each of which had painted faces that were frozen in hideous grins. While we were inspecting the marionettes, we were aware of a noise. Something that sounded like it was coming from the front of the shop was a soft, harmonious music. Our hearts were racing in our chests as we froze in place. The spooky music became more loud as we made our way back to the main area in a leisurely and patient manner. An antique music box with a wind-up mechanism was discovered by us, and it was resting on a shelf that was covered in dust. While we were watching, the music box started playing at a quicker rate, and the melody started to get distorted and almost frenzied. Marionettes that were displayed on the shelves started to twitch, and their wooden limbs began to jerk in an irregular manner. One of the marionettes, a clown with a painted smile and piercing blue eyes, suddenly sprang off the shelf, its strings hanging lifelessly. The clown was represented by the marionette. A thud was heard as it fell on the floor, and it immediately started crawling towards us, its wooden limbs making a scraping sound on the flooring. Jasper and I both yelled as we turned around and ran toward the window that had been shattered. We ran out of the shop as quickly as we could, not pausing until we were out on the street in a secure location. Our lungs were burning, and our hearts were pounding. The abandoned toy shop was never revisited by us again before. After a few weeks had passed, the recollection of the scary marionettes and the disturbing music box continued to haunt our nightmares. I am still able to hear the warped music, which continues to reverberate in the deepest recesses of my memory to this very day. In addition, every time I come across a marionette, I can't help but feel a chill go down my spine. Story 4. This is Blackwood Pines, Colorado. Doesn't the very name of the thing have a foreboding quality to it? The town is a tiny and remote community that is tucked away in the Rocky Mountains. It is a spot where the shadows seem to linger for a longer period of time than in any other location. Permit me to tell you that serving as a fire lookout on Mount Blackwood over the summer was the most uncomfortable experience I have ever had in my whole life. I spent the summer there. There was just one building, the lookout tower, which was positioned dangerously on the pinnacle of the mountain, a great distance away from any settlement. The only people I had to talk to were the wind that was blowing through the pine trees and the odd hawk that was flying about above me. Each day was lengthy and boring, and it consisted of constantly looking over the horizon for any indications of smoke. However, it was the evenings that made me feel the most uneasy. A handful of the initial nights were completely unremarkable. I would attempt to ignore the gnawing loneliness by reading, listening to the radio, and doing other things. However, after that, I began to notice it. There is a shadow, a dark figure that, like a person, that is hiding at the edge of the tree line. Just as darkness fell, it would materialize, its shape twisting and whirling in the moonlight as it entered the scene. I made an effort to justify it by convincing myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the light or a dynamic dance of shadows on the trees. Despite this, the sensation of discomfort continued to be there, and it became more intense with each passing night. In the course of one night, the shadow became closer. Suddenly, I was able to make out the person more clearly. It was tall and emaciated, with long and lanky limbs. It was standing on the edge of the meadow, its eyes staring blankly at the tower that served as the lookout. Despite the fact that my hands were shaking, I took my binoculars and concentrated on the person. During the time that I was observing, the shadow seemed to get more elongated, reaching upwards towards the heavens. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, a fundamental horror that engulfed me from the very center of my being. While my pulse was racing in my chest, I slapped the binoculars down on the ground. I made a last-ditch effort to dispel the darkness by turning on all of the lights in the tower. As I walked around the cramped room, my thoughts were racing as I attempted to make sense of what I had seen. That was a delusion, right? If I don't get enough sleep, would my mind play tricks on me? Or was it something else, something that was perhaps far more nefarious? My voice was shaking when I made a radio call to the ranger station the next morning. I informed them about the shadow, as well as the uncomfortable sensation that I was experiencing. The ranger, who was on the other end of the line, a stern individual called Dale, listened with patience. When I was done, he let out a sigh. "According to him, you've seen the Shadow Man," he remarked in a quiet voice. "The Shadow Man." I proceeded to repeat, my brow furrowing. He said, "It's an old legend." And he was right. This mountain range is inhabited by a ghostly presence. The people who live in the woods are said to be the ones who feed on fear and the loneliness that they experience. I was in a state of disbelief as I listened to the ranger's comments, and my intellect was hard at work trying to make sense of them using the reasonable side of my brain. On the other hand, I was aware that Dale was correct. It was clear to me that the Shadow Man was not only a creation of my mind since I had saw him. The next days of my stay were marked by a persistent and gnawing worry that I could not shake. Because I was terrified of what I may see, I avoided glancing out the windows when it was nighttime. The sound of the wind rustling through the pines was like mocking laughter, and the sound of the leaves rustling was like footsteps coming. I had the impression that someone was always there, keeping a careful eye on everything I did. At long last, the day had come when I was supposed to be released of an obligation. As I prepared to pack my luggage, my hands began to shake with excitement. While I was making my way down the mountain, I couldn't help but look back at the lookout tower, which was silhouetted against the dim light of the setting sun. There was a moment when I was very certain that I saw the Shadow Man standing at the edge of the clearing, its black figure blending in with the shadows generated by the trees. I did not go back to Blackwood Pines at any point. The memory of the Shadow Man, as well as the overwhelming horror that I experienced, continues to torment me to this very day. And every time I find myself in a spot that is dark and lonely, I can't help but feel a chill go down my spine. I can't help but wonder if the Shadow Man is watching me from the shadows. We are waiting. Story 5. Ilara is a nurse, and she is my cousin. Her natural inclination has always been to assist other people, even when they are in the most difficult of situations. Several years ago, she accepted a position at Willow Creek Sanatorium, which is an institution that provides long-term care and is located in the rolling hills of rural Vermont. Among the locals, there was a reputation for the location, a dark past that was spoken in hushed tones from time to time. Stories of fatalities that could not be explained, patients who vanished without a trace, and weird incidents that took place inside the walls of the sanatorium that were getting on in years. Ever the pragmatic, Ilara looked at these stories and disregarded them as folklore, claiming that they were the result of hyperactive imaginations. On the other hand, she quickly discovered that some tales may have their origins in a horrific reality. This vast facility was known as Willow Creek, and it was a maze consisting of lengthy hallways, chambers with little lighting, and reverberating quiet. The patients, who were mostly old and suffering from a variety of illnesses were a group of people who were reserved and silent. Almost immediately, Ilara became used to her routine, and she began providing compassionate and devoted care to her patients. However, as the weeks went by, she started to become aware of things that were uncomfortable. The sound of footsteps in empty rooms, the brief glimpses of shadowy forms at the fringe of her vision, and the faint murmurs that reverberated down the halls at night were all things that she sometimes heard. Ilara was doing her rounds one evening when she became aware of a gentle crying sound emanating from one of the apartments that was vacant. The beam of her flashlight was able to pierce through the darkness as she gingerly crossed the threshold. The only sound that could be heard was the steady ticking of a grandfather clock that was located in the corner of the room. The bed was set up meticulously. There was nothing that Ilara could find in the closet, beneath the bed, or even in the bathroom that was next to the room. The crying, on the other hand, persisted, becoming more louder and more urgent. The feeling of a shiver going down Ilara's spine caused her to retreat from the room. After that, Ilara was working the late shift the next evening. While she was making her way down a hallway that was completely empty, she heard a voice calling her name. The voice was scratchy and ghostly, and it appeared to radiate from the walls themselves. "Ilara," it said. Ilara came to a halt, her heart thumping rhythmically in her chest. Despite her best efforts, the corridor was devoid of any people. A second time, the voice muttered, "Ilara," this time coming in closer. The sound of Ilara's shoes reverberated across the empty corridor as she turned and bolted. A lady called Agnes, who had been employed at Willow Creek for more than 30 years, was one of the more experienced nurses, and she went to her for advice. The expression of knowing anguish was carved onto Agnes's face as she listened carefully. "The whispers," she remarked, her voice hushed as she spoke. "They're the spirits of the patients who died here, trapped within these walls." Agnes's remarks struck a chord with Ilara, despite the fact that she was suspicious. She had saw and heard an excessive amount of things to consider it only a coincidence. She started her investigation into the history of Willow Creek by reading old newspaper articles and looking through documents kept by the community. It came to her attention that the sanatorium had a troubled history, one that included instances of neglect and abuse. In spite of reports that they had been murdered, a great number of patients had passed away under inexplicable circumstances, and their deaths were ascribed to natural causes. Ilara developed an understanding of the whispers as a result of this newfound information. The laments of those who had been forgotten, the voices of those who had endured pain and passed away inside the confines of Willow Creek, were still heard. She had a strong feeling of melancholy and a profound sense of empathy for these disembodied spirits. On a certain evening, Ilara was put to work in the ancient wing of the sanatorium, which was a sector that had been off limits for many years. An old and weak lady by the name of Mrs. Albright was the patient that she was checking on. She had been moved from another institution before to her arrival. The muttering were heard once again by Ilara as she entered Mrs. Albright's chamber, and this time they were much louder than before. She was surrounded by a cacophony of voices, all of which were pleading, begging, and wailing in agony around her. Instantaneously, the temperature in the room dropped, and there was a definite sensation of dread in the air. It seemed as if the shadows in the corners were becoming darker and combining into a black mass that was spinning. Ilara was aware of a presence in the room, and she felt a weight that was icy and heavy settle on her chest. She attempted to address Mrs. Albright, but the elderly lady was no longer there, totally disappeared. The covers were rumpled and the bed was unoccupied, giving the impression that someone had recently been there. During that precise instant, Ilara was aware that she needed to go from Willow Creek. There were too many things going on, including the disappearances, the shadows, and the murmurs. The next day, she submitted her resignation, packed her belongings, and left the sanatorium without turning around to look back. Her absence from Willow Creek was never repeated. However, the echoes, the screams of those who have been forgotten, continue to haunt her nightmares. A continual reminder of the sinister truths that were concealed beneath the walls of the mental institution that had been abandoned. And every time she hears a whisper in the dark, she can't help but wonder if it's the voices of Willow Creek reaching out from beyond the dead. She can't make up her mind about what it may be. Story 6. This is Harmony Lane. Irony is blatantly obvious in the term itself. In the tranquil village of Oak Haven, Illinois, there is a street that is bordered with trees and is quite quiet. A neighborhood in which families enjoy barbecuing on their lawns, children run about and play in the streets, and neighbors talk to one another across white picket fences. As far as it seems, there is a terrible story that is only spoken in hushed tones, and it is hidden under the surface of the suburban routine that people have established. A story about the person who accumulates souls. During the spring of 2015, my wife Rosalind and I, together with our 2 young children, Calla and Finn, relocated to Harmony Lane. As a family, we were seeking for a tranquil environment in which to raise our children, a community in which we could establish our roots. It seems as if Harmony Lane was the ideal choice. The residences were quaint, the neighbors were kind, and the schools received consistently great marks. We rapidly made ourselves at home and embraced the wonderful lifestyle of the little village. However, something did not feel quite right. I couldn't exactly put my finger on it, but I just couldn't shake the feeling of dread that was sneaking up on me. All of it began with little things. There was a flickering streetlight that never appeared to be repaired, and there was a continued coolness in the air, even on the days that were the hottest. The rumors began to circulate after that. It seemed as if the shadows and the empty spaces between the homes were the source of the faint, almost inaudible whispers that were heard at that time. When I was out walking our dog, Buster, one evening, I suddenly became aware of an old Victorian home that was located at the end of the block. It was in a state of disrepair, with paint that was flaking off and windows that were boarded up. A perceptible feeling of neglect pervaded everything, casting a palpable air of rot over it. Regarding the home, I inquired about it with Mrs. Henderson, who is our neighbor next door. After a moment of hesitation, during which her eyes darted about nervously, she finally spoke in a low tone. "That's the old Blackwood place," she commented the other day. "Nobody has lived there for a number of years. People claim that it is haunted. Are you haunted?" I laughed at the concept, referring to it as a superstition that is common in small towns. On the other hand, the picture of the rundown home that was obscured by darkness would not leave my mind. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to escape the sensation that something was off. The whispers became more audible and became more persistent. I began seeing things that were on the fringe of my vision, such as short glimpses of shadowy persons and black forms that were moving just outside the reach of the streetlights. It was also spotted by Rosalind. Her formerly upbeat mood has been replaced with a persistent sense of uneasiness, and she has become more reclusive and jumpy. The youngsters noticed that they were experiencing nightmares and that they were waking up in the middle of the night crying. A terrifying shriek greeted me as I awoke one night. No, it was Calla, our youngest child. With my pulse thumping in my chest, I had no choice but to run inside her room. With her eyes wide with fear and her body shaking, she was sitting up in bed. Her eyes were wide with panic. "The man," she cried out, pointing to the window of her room. "The man with the glowing eyes." There was nothing visible as I peered out the window. There was nothing save the roadway, which was illuminated by the dim light of the moon. Attempting to reassure Calla that it was simply a nightmare, I attempted to calm her down. To a certain extent, however, I was aware that it was more than that. The next day, I went to the neighborhood library with the intention of acquiring further information on the old Blackwood location. As I investigated, I found out that the home had a troubled past. It had been the residence of a hermit called Elias Blackwood, who had resided there in the early 1900s. He had lived there for over a century. There were rumors going around about him, including tales of bizarre rites, of people who had gone missing, and of whispering in the night. One chilly winter night, he vanished without a trace, leaving the home alone and without anybody to find him. As she drew nearer, the librarian, who was an old lady with the most compassionate eyes, lowered her voice. "They say that Elias Blackwood was a collector of souls," she said at the same time. "He lured unsuspecting victims to his house, trapping their spirits within its walls." While my thoughts was racing, I exited the library. At this point, the pieces of the jigsaw were beginning to fit together. All indications led to Elias Blackwood, the collector of souls, including the whispering, the shadows, and the blazing eyes, among other things. I was unable to go to sleep that night. While I was lying in bed, I listened to the murmurs and felt the suffocating weight of Blackwood's presence in our house. In order to keep from falling into the hands of the collector of souls, I was aware that we needed to depart Harmony Lane. We lowered our vehicle in the middle of the night, under the watchful eye of the moon, and put our stuff in their respective containers. In the midst of our departure, I caught a glimpse of the old Blackwood residence, its shadowy silhouette standing out against the backdrop of the night sky. I was so certain that I saw a person standing in the window, its eyes shining with a brightness that was not characteristic of the human eye, a terrifying reminder of the horror that lies under the surface of Harmony Lane. Another unsettling reminder. Never once did we turn around. Story 7. The upstate region of New York's Route 44, a lengthy and winding route that passes through thick trees and hills that are undulating in shape. Beautiful during the day, but when night falls, it's altogether another. I will never forget the terrifying experience that I had, which included phantom lights, inexplicable occurrences, and a terrifying encounter. During the autumn of 2008 it was. I had just returned after spending the weekend in Albany, and I was already on my way back to Syracuse. It had been a long time since the sun had set, and the only thing that could be seen on the road ahead was the headlights of my vehicle. At the same time as the leaves were changing vivid hues of red and gold, the air was light and refreshing. A tranquil drive, the type that helps you clear your mind and calms your spirit, was what we experienced. Until that stopped being the case. When I came around a curve in the road, I was able to see them. There are lights, luminous white spheres floating just above the tree line over the forest. They danced and flickered, moving in an irregular manner that defied any rational reason to explain their behavior. My pulse was hammering in my chest, and my eyes were fixated on the weird show that was taking place. I slowed down. Had they been headlights for a car? Does the moon have any reflections? It was beyond my ability to comprehend. I stopped my vehicle on the shoulder of the road and turned off both the engine and the headlights. There was no sign of the lights, and their ethereal radiance continued to illuminate the trees in the area. I reached out my phone and took a few shots in the hopes of capturing proof of the peculiar occurrences that were taking place. When I glanced at the photographs, however, my blood began to run cold. It was impossible to make out the lights in the photographs. Despite the fact that I was aware of their presence, the camera was unable to catch them. My thoughts was racing as I sat in my automobile, stuck in place. Where did these lights come from? Do you know where they were coming from? The ghost lights of Route 44 were a local mythology that had been handed down from generation to generation, and I had heard tales about them. There had been reports of strange spheres of light that had been seen in the night, leading cars astray and drawing them into the dark depths of the woodland. Throughout my life, I had always disregarded them as a kind of folklore, the result of busy imaginations. But now that I had seen the lights with my own eyes, I was not so sure about him. I made the decision to continue with my driving at a cautious pace, keeping my eyes on the road in front of me. It seemed as if the lights were following me, keeping up with my vehicle, and their eerie brilliance produced shadows on the trees that were lengthy and dancing. Even though I made an effort to ignore them and concentrate on the road, their presence was so overpowering that it served as a continual reminder of the unknown. I was getting closer to a particularly dark section of road when I saw that the lights were becoming more intense, their brightness increasing, and their motions becoming more desperate. They whirled and pulsed, suggesting that they were attempting to communicate with me and warn me about something. With my knuckles becoming white and my foot pushing down on the pedal, I tightened my grasp on the steering wheel. I had to get out of there as soon as possible in order to get away from the uncomfortable presence of the lights. At that moment, a person suddenly materialized in the center of the road. A towering figure that was hidden by darkness, with its shape being unclear and its features being concealed by the mist. My automobile came to a screaming stop only a few inches away from the figure when I slapped on the brakes abruptly. My pulse was racing in my chest as I gazed in bewilderment at the situation. A silhouette of the figure's black body could be seen against the background of the phantom lights as it remained still. After then, the figure disappeared in the same instant that it had been visible. It's gone. As the lights were turned down, the frenetic dance of the lights ceased, and their ethereal glow gradually disappeared into the darkness. While I was sitting in my vehicle, I was shaking, and my breath came out in ragged gasps. I waited for a few minutes, my eyes searching the road, and my ears searching for any indication of the man or the lights. In contrast, there was nothing. All that could be heard was the sound of the leaves rustling and the hoot of an owl in the distance. Despite the fact that my hands were trembling and my head was still whirling from the terrifying experience, I carefully started my automobile. Due to the fact that the picture of the dark man and the phantom lights was ingrained in my mind, I drove the remaining distance home in a trance. This is the last time I've ever traveled on Route 44 at night. Too clear and too unnerving is the recollection of that night, of the lights that could not be explained and the shadowy figure that was there. And every time I hear accounts of inexplicable occurrences, I can't help but think about the ghost lights of Route 44 and the terrifying experience that altered my perspective on the unknown for the rest of my life. Story 8. A hotel known as the Grand Blackwood. On the waterfront in Portland, Maine, there is a magnificent remnant of a bygone period that is standing bravely, despite the fact that it has somewhat faded. The elaborate exterior, the large ballroom, and the luxurious suites all give off hints of a glamorous past, a period of time that was characterized by elegance and refinement. It is a haunting tale that is whispered among the staff, a story about the haunted ballroom and the spectral dancer that never departs. However, under the surface of grandeur lurks a deadly truth. My employment at the Grand Blackwood began in the summer of 2012, and I was given the position of night concierge. For a history enthusiast like me, it was the work of my dreams. The walls of the hotel resounded with the tales of previous generations, revealing that the establishment was rich in history. I would spend my evenings aimlessly roaming around the peaceful halls, taking in the old furniture, the magnificent chandeliers, and the pictures of visitors who had been forgotten for a very long time. It seemed as if I were a part of the hotel's intricate fabric, that I had a feeling of connection and belonging to the establishment. However, as the weeks went by, I started to become aware of things that were uncomfortable. The sound of footsteps reverberating through empty halls, the faint music that was drifting from the locked ballroom, and the short glances of a shadowy figure in the grand staircase were all things that were heard. At first, I thought that these happenings were the result of my imagination, which was the result of staying up late and having a busy mind. However, the occurrences became more regular and of a more prominent kind, to the point that I could no longer ignore them. While I was going about the building one evening, I became aware of the unique sound of music emanating from the ballroom, a waltz that is creepy and full of melancholy. Despite the fact that my pulse was racing in my chest, I approached the closed doors with caution. My ear was pushed against the thick wood, and I listened with great concentration. It seemed as if a complete orchestra was playing just outside the doors as the volume of the music increased and the beat became more distinct. In spite of the fact that my hand was shaking, I grabbed for the doorknob and carefully pulled the door open. With the chandeliers throwing long, dancing shadows on the polished floor, the ballroom was enveloped in an ethereal radiance that was emanating from the ceiling. In the middle of the room, there was a lady who was standing there. She was wearing a long, flowing white gown, and her black hair was falling down her back like a waterfall. She moved with an elegance that seemed to come naturally to her body flowing to the beat of the music that one could not see. The ballroom was completely empty, and she was dancing by herself. My eyes were fixated on the phantom dancer as I stood there motionless, taking a deep breath that caught in my throat. She seemed to be not aware of my presence, as if she were immersed in her own world. Her motions were smooth and seductive. As I stood there, fascinated by her ethereal beauty and the eerie song that filled the room, I observed her for what seemed like an eternity. Following that, she disappeared just as suddenly as she had arrived. It's gone. Following the cessation of the music and the disappearance of the ethereal radiance, the ballroom became dark and quiet. My mind was having a hard time making sense of what I had just seen, and my heart was beating very fast. I stood there for a second. After some time had passed, I was informed by one of the more senior bellhops, a gentleman called Arthur, that the spectral dancer was a legendary figure at the Grand Blackwood. She was a famous dancer in the early 1900s, and her name was Serafina. She had a great deal of success. The affluent businessman who had pledged to marry her had won her heart, and she had fallen in love with him. However, on the evening of their engagement celebration, which was held in the large ballroom, he deserted her, leaving her distraught and all by herself. Serafina had committed herself by jumping from the balcony that overlooked the ballroom. She was unable to face the humiliation and disgrace that she had been suffering from. They claim that her ghost continues to haunt the ballroom, eternally looking for the love she had lost and forever dancing to the melancholy waltz that was playing on the night of her untimely death. After I had my first contact with Serafina, I continued to work at the Grand Blackwood for a number of months. I would often hear the faint notes of the waltz floating from the ballroom, and every once in a while, I would get a short sight of her ghostly figure dancing in the shadows. The presence of her, on the other hand, never made me feel intimidated. My heart was filled with sorrow, and I felt a tremendous feeling of empathy for her awful narrative. One day, I decided to move on with my life and found employment at a new hotel in a different city. On the other hand, the memory of Serafina, as well as the eerie ballroom and the spectral dancer, continues to stay with me over the years, one that serves as a sobering reminder of the continuing power of love, grief, and the souls that continue to exist long after we have passed away. Story 9. Hollow of the Hemlock. Doesn't the very name seem like it's a forlorn place? There is a little valley that is tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It is known for its seclusion, a location that is characterized by thick woods, twisting streams, and an unnerving quiet that lingers heavily in the atmosphere. I was able to spend the summer there working as a park ranger at the Hemlock Hollow State Park, and let me tell you, it was an experience that I will never forget. The park was enormous, and for the most part, relatively unknown. Its paths wound their way through miles of unspoiled wilderness. It was my responsibility to patrol the trails, maintain the campgrounds, and watch out for the well-being of the people that came to the park. The days were long and silent, and the evenings were filled with the sounds of the forest. It was a profession that required one to work alone. The sound of leaves rustling, the hooting of owls, and the howling of coyotes were heard in the distance. And the hushed conversations. There was a subtle rustle in the trees, a low murmur that was borne by the wind, and that was the beginning of the whispering. When I first heard them, I thought they were the noises of the forest, the natural symphony of the wilderness. But as the weeks went by, the whispers became more audible and different from one another. It seemed as if they were emanating from the trees themselves, from the very center of the dimly lit forest. In the course of my patrolling of the trails one evening, I became aware of a voice calling out my name. The voice was gentle and ghostly, and it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Ethan," it murmured over and over again. My heart was racing in my chest as I came to a halt, and my eyes were searching the woods that were all about me. A second time, the voice muttered, "Ethan," this time coming in closer. I turned around and fled, the sound of my shoes reverberating on the empty path. One of the more experienced park guards, a grizzled guy called Jedediah, who had been in the park for more than 30 years, was the person I confided in first. Jedediah listened with patience, his aged features carved with a knowing grief across his expression. He said the words, "The whispering pines," in a modest tone. "They're the spirits of those who were lost in the woods, their voices trapped among the trees." Jedediah's remarks struck a chord with me, despite the fact that I was suspicious. Because I had saw and heard so much, I could not just dismiss it as a coincidence. As part of my investigation into the past of Hemlock Hollow, I started looking through old park documents and investigating local legend. I learned that the valley had a troubled history, a history of mysterious disappearances, of hikers who vanished without a trace and whose remains were never located. Following the acquisition of this information, I started to comprehend the murmurs. The sounds of those who had strayed into the woods and never returned were heard, and these were the laments of those who had gone missing. I was overcome with a strong feeling of melancholy and a profound sense of pity for these lives that had been lost. One evening, I was camped in the middle of the forest, a considerable distance from the closest trailhead. While I was sitting by the campfire, the flames formed flickering shadows on the trees that were all about me. I heard the whispers once again, and this time they were much louder than they had been before. I was surrounded by a cacophony of voices, all of which were pleading, begging, and shouting out in fear and desperation. The air became chilly all of a sudden, and the flames of the bonfire began to flicker and then go out. It seemed as if the shadows in the forest darkened and merged together to form black masses that swirled about. I became aware of a presence, a weight that was icy and heavy, and it settled on my chest. Despite the fact that my hand was shaking, I reached for my flashlight and projected the beam into the darkness. A person could be seen standing there, on the outskirts of the clearing. There was a tall, lanky figure that was difficult to make out due to the shadows that disguised its distinguishing appearance. There was no movement on its part, and its eyes were riveted on me. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, a fundamental horror that engulfed me from the very center of my being. My torch beam was twirling wildly in the woods as I turned and rushed into the darkness. I was stumbling through the darkness. It wasn't until I reached my pickup, which was parked at the edge of the park, that I finally stopped running. Despite the fact that my heart was beating in my chest, I leaped inside and slammed the door shut. I cranked the engine and was on my way, leaving Hemlock Hollow in the rearview mirror. I did not go back to Hemlock Hollow at any point. The recollection of the pines that were whispering and the mysterious figure that was there in the woods is too clear and too unnerving. And every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees, I can't help but wonder if it's the voices of Hemlock Hollow, the screams of the lost, reaching out from the darkness. I can't help but wonder if their voices are reaching out from the darkness. Story 10. The Cemetery of Redwood, a location that is suitable for silent thought, for dark pondering, and for remembering. An oasis of tranquility and beauty, this location is found in the middle of Marin County, California, surrounded by tall redwood trees. It is a spot of quiet beauty, or so I had believed, up until the point when I came face to face with the spectral figure that lingers on the sacred grounds. I've always had a strong fascination with cemeteries, certainly not in a morbid manner, but rather in a manner that acknowledges and respects their past, their tales, and the lives that they represent. There was something special about the Redwood Cemetery, with its old trees and aged headstones, that made it so appealing. I used to go there very often, and when I was there, I would roam about among the graves, read the inscriptions, and think about the lives of the people who were buried there. I had my first meeting with the ghost for the first time during one of these excursions, which took place on a chilly and foggy day. When I came upon her, I was strolling down a route that was concealed from view, deep inside the cemetery. There was a lady who was wearing a long, flowing white gown, and her black hair was falling down along her back. It seemed as if she was praying as she stood beside a worn gravestone with her head bent. I halted, my pulse thumping in my chest, and my eyes riveted on the spectral form that was standing before me. She seemed to be completely oblivious to my presence, as if she were mired in her own world of pain and anguish. I observed her for a little period of time, reserving my right to interfere with her private moment of sorrow. When I moved closer to her, she disappeared without a trace. It's gone, as if she had never been there in the first place. For a few period, I stood there, my thoughts racing and my heart continuing to beat rapidly. It may have been a trick of the light. Is it a product of my own imagination? What else might it have been? Something that was far more unsettling. When I arrived to the location where the lady had been standing, I went to the headstone. Inscribed on the granite headstone was the name Eleanor Vance and the dates 1888 to 1918. It was a straightforward piece of memorial. I felt a chill go down my spine as I ran my fingertips over the frozen stone that was perfectly smooth. Who was Eleanor Vance exactly? Why did her soul continue to follow her to the Redwood Cemetery? I went back to the cemetery the next week, and I couldn't explain why I felt the need to go back there. As I made my way around the cemetery, I looked for any hints or information that could come to light on Eleanor Vance. It was at the local history archives that I was finally able to locate her obituary. At the time of her passing, Eleanor was a young lady, having just reached the age of 30. At the beginning of the 20th century, the word consumption, which was often used to refer to TB, was included as the cause of death. In her obituary, she was characterized as a sensitive and kind spirit who was cherished by both her family and her friends. On several occasions, I went to Redwood Cemetery, and I couldn't help but be pulled to Eleanor's tomb. As well as that, I saw her apparition on many times. She never stopped wearing white, never stopped standing by her gravestone, and never stopped being trapped in her own world of sadness. The presence of her, on the other hand, never made me feel intimidated. My heart was filled with sorrow, and I felt a tremendous feeling of empathy for her awful narrative. A little image that had faded and was nestled into the cleft of the headstone was something that I spotted one day when I was standing at Eleanor's grave. I withdrew it with great care, my fingers shaking as I did. So, the subject of the painting was Eleanor, a beautiful young lady who had a sweet smile and eyes that were filled with sadness. There was a single word scribbled in fading writing on the reverse of the card, and it read, "Forgotten." During that moment, I came to the realization that Eleanor's soul remained in Redwood Cemetery, not out of any ill will or malicious intent, but rather because of a profound feeling of isolation and a dread of being forgotten. As I reinserted the image into the gravestone, my heart broke for the person who had been taken from this world. My visits to Redwood Cemetery continued, and each time I went, I left a new flower on Eleanor's grave. Additionally, any time I came across her apparition, I would communicate with her, assuring her that she was not forgotten and that her tale continued to be told. Both the frequency and intensity of the apparitions decreased throughout the course of time, as if Eleanor, who had at long last found calm, was gradually disappearing. Eleanor Vance is constantly remembered in my visits to Redwood Cemetery, where I continue to pay my respects. Even though I haven't seen her ghost in years, I can still sense her presence. She's a gentle reminder of the lives that were previously lived and the tales that continue to reverberate throughout the sacred grounds of Redwood Cemetery. Story 11. Street named Willow. In the middle of Savannah, Georgia, there is a street that is tiny and cobblestone, a well-known destination for its enchanting antique stores, its small cafes, and its old architecture. A dark secret, however, is concealed in plain sight and may be found nestled away between two lovely mansions. The defunct Opera Theatre in question, a location that has lost its splendor, there is a reverberating quiet, and there is a terrifying presence that continues to remain long after the last curtain has dropped. My discovery of the Opera House was a complete and utter coincidence. I was taking a stroll through the alleyways of Savannah, lured to the city by its illustrious past and the sense of mystery that it exudes. A little alleyway that was wedged between two buildings caught my attention. It was only a little bit broader than my shoulders. Due to my curiosity, I decided to go down the alley, and the sound of my footfall reverberated on the wet cobblestones. I saw it as I reached the end of the alley, the House of the Opera. The windows have been boarded up, and the doors have been bolted shut, and the once grand facade is now in ruins. There was a perceptible feeling of neglect that pervaded the structure, which exuded an aura of decay. I strained my eyes to see what was going on inside the boarded-up windows as I looked through a breach in the window. The inside was gloomy and dusty, with magnificent chandeliers hanging from the ceiling in a dead manner and velvet chairs that were worn and shredded. A disturbing relic of a time long since past. It was a specter of the person it had been in the past. Later on, I was informed by a local historian that the Opera House, which is considered to be a crown gem of Savannah's cultural scene, had been constructed in the late 1800s. Distinguished opera singers, well-known actors, and dignitaries from all over the globe have performed there in the past. On the other hand, calamity hit in the early 1900s. In the middle of a performance of Faust, a fire broke out, and the Opera House was completely consumed by flames. As a result of the fire, a great number of individuals lost their lives, and their cries could be heard across Savannah. The burned remnants of the Opera House were allowed to deteriorate, serving as a solemn memorial to the sad event that could never be constructed again. Their voices can be heard reverberating through the empty hallways of the abandoned Opera House, and their presence can be felt in the eerie quiet. They believe that the souls of those who perished in the fire continue to haunt the building. It goes without saying that I was suspicious, but the tales piqued my interest. On many occasions I found myself attracted back to the opera theatre by a power that I could not explain. I would imagine the ghosts of the past while I stood outdoors, listening to the wind whistling through the shattered windows and visualizing them. Later that evening, I made the decision to go inside. A loose board was discovered in one of the windows, and I cautiously pried it apart with my own hands. My pulse was racing in my chest as I crawled into the aperture, and the beam of my flashlight was cutting through the darkness. The only sound that could be heard emanating from the inside was the groaning of the floors under my boots. The air inside was heavy with dust. I spent some time exploring the Opera House, using my headlamp to shed light on the deteriorating splendor of the once outstanding structure. The velvet curtains on the stage were ripped and shredded, and the theater itself was in ruins. It had formerly served as a platform for magnificent performances. When it was previously alive with the pulsating sounds of music, the orchestra pit was now completely quiet and devoid of any sound. After having been filled by an enthusiastic audience in the past, the chairs are now in a state of disorder, coated in dust and garbage. There was a noise that I heard while I was walking through the auditorium. There was a subdued, melodious hum that seemed to originate from the stage. My pulse was hammering in my chest as I came to a halt, and my eyes were searching the darkness. As it continued to intensify and became more clear, the humming eventually resolved into a mournful tune. The opera Faust, which had been playing on the night of the fire, was the source of the aria that was being played. The beam of light from my flashlight illuminated the burnt remnants of the background as I made my way carefully through the crowd towards the stage. I looked over and saw her standing right in the middle of the stage. The image depicts a lady who is wearing a long, flowing white robe and has black hair that falls down her back. The music seemed to have a profound effect on her as she remained still with her eyes closed. My eyes were fixated on the ethereal form as I stood there motionless, taking a deep breath that caught in my throat. With a voice that was delicate and eerie, she started singing, and the opera theater was filled with the sorrowful tune of Faust. I was entranced by her spectral presence and the terrifying beauty of her voice as I observed her for what seemed like an eternity that passed before my eyes. Following then, she disappeared just as the last notes of the aria began to fade away. It's gone. The music came to an end, and the quiet had returned, becoming oppressive and thick. My mind was having a hard time making sense of what I had just seen, and my heart was beating very fast. I stood there for a second. As I hurriedly made my way back to the damaged window, I scrambled out of the opera house and into the fresh air of the night. Never again did I go back to the defunct opera theater that was located on Willow Street. The recollection of the spectral singer, as well as the eerie tune of Faust, is too vivid and too unpleasant to be ignored. I can't help but think of the abandoned opera house and the haunting spirit that remains inside its deteriorating walls every time I hear the faint notes of opera music. This is something that I can't help but think about. Story 12. The Manor of Ashworth. Mendocino, California, is home to a magnificent and imposing Victorian house that is positioned on top of a hill that is prone to wind and overlooks the harsh coastline. In addition to its spectacular beauty and breathtaking ocean vistas, this location also has a past that is frightening and can be heard whispering down its shadowy hallways. I was a caregiver there for the summer, and let me tell you, it was an experience that shook me to my very core. I spent the summer there. It had been years since the mansion had been occupied by its former owners, who had left it vacant following a string of tragic events that could not be explained. Maintaining the home, ensuring that the grounds were kept neat, and ensuring the safety of the estate were all part of my job description. The days were long and silent, and the evenings were filled with the sounds of the ocean pounding on the rocks below. It was a life lived in isolation, the darkness as well. Almost immediately after I arrived, I became aware of a presence inside the mansion. I couldn't quite escape the feeling of dread that was sneaking up on me, which was a subtle disquiet. All of it began with little things. There was a lighting that was flickering in the great hall. There was a draft in the library, and there was a slight aroma of perfume in the bedrooms that were unoccupied. There were then the shadows that appeared. There were shadowy, ephemeral things that seemed to move about on the edge of my vision, and they were hiding just outside the reach of the illuminated bulb. While I was adventuring around the top levels of the mansion one evening, I came upon it. A shadow figure that was tall and thin was seen standing at the end of a lengthy corridor that was completely black. The shadows concealed its features, and its shape was vague. It remained still, seeming to be unmoving. My pulse was hammering in my chest, and my eyes were fixated on the unnerving apparition. I froze on the spot. My attempt to justify it consisted of convincing myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the light or a dance of shadows on the wall. However, the sensation of discomfort continued to be there, and it became more intense with each passing second. My hand was shaking as I went for the light switch as I approached the person in a cautious and deliberate manner. At that moment, the corridor sprang to life, but it revealed nothing. The figure has vanished, totally disappeared. For a few periods, I stood there, my thoughts racing and my heart continuing to beat rapidly. That was a delusion, right? Is it a product of my own imagination, or was it something else? Something that was perhaps far more nefarious. I started my investigation into the history of Ashworth Manor by reading old newspaper articles and looking through data from the local community. I came to the realization that the mansion had a troubled history, a track record of deaths and disappearances that were not addressed. Tragic events had befallen the previous owners, who were a rich family by the name of the Ashworths for many years. It was discovered that their oldest son had drowned in the ocean, their daughter had fallen from a window, and Mr. Ashworth had vanished without a trace, with his corpse never being located. People in the surrounding community spoke of a curse, an evil ghost that haunted the mansion, seeking retribution for wrongs that had been committed in the past. My first reaction was to disregard these stories as superstition. Nevertheless, the frightening occurrences that took place at the mansion caused me to doubt my own initial skepticism. The appearance of the shadow figure became a common occurrence. I would see it moving stealthily around the corridors, standing at the entrances, and keeping a watchful eye on me from the shadows. Although I made an effort to ignore it and concentrate on my job, its presence was overpowering and served as a continual reminder of the sad past of the mansion. A terrifying shriek greeted me as I awoke one night. There was a sound of sheer fear that reverberated throughout the mansion. As soon as I heard the scream, I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and ran in the direction of the origin of the sound. The master bedroom, which was the room in which Mr. Ashworth had been seen the most recently, seemed to be the source of the sound. As I carefully approached the room, the beam generated by my flashlight was able to pierce through the darkness. The only sound that could be heard was the steady ticking of a grandfather clock that was located in the corner of the room. The bed was set up meticulously. However, as I was about to leave, I saw it. A silhouette of the shadow figure could be seen standing at the doorway, its black shape striking out against the dim moonlight that was coming in through the window. It was more distinct than ever before, with its shape being more differentiated and its characteristics being more defined. At this moment, I was able to make out its eyes, which radiated an unusual light and were intently focused on me with a malignant intensity. I had a surge of panic that washed over me, a fear that was so fundamental that it rendered me unable to move. In a slow and deliberate manner, the apparition extended its hand towards me, its long skeleton fingers stretching out. I yelled as I turned and ran into the darkness corridors, my flashlight beam twirling wildly in the shadows. I was staggering down the hallways. The only time I stopped running was when I approached the front door, at which point I broke out of the mansion and into the fresh air of the night. I did not go back to Ashworth Manor at any point. The recollection of the shadow form, as well as the scream that was so terrible, is too immediate and too unnerving. And every time I find myself in a spot that is dark and alone, I can't help but feel a chill go down my spine. I can't help but wonder if the shadow figure is watching me from the shadows. We are waiting. Story 13, Trestle built on Carter Creek. The skeleton framework of a tall building made of rusty steel and rotting wood, which spans a steep ravine in the distant wilderness of Montana, a remnant from a bygone period, with a tribute to the inventiveness and aspiration of the pioneers of the railroad industry. a site that is said to be haunted by a terrifying tale, namely the legend of the Phantom Train. An elderly prospector by the name of Jedediah, who had been a resident of the region for more than half a century, was the one who first told me about the Phantom Train. He related to me the story of a train that had wrecked on the trestle many years ago, causing it to plunge into the ravine below, resulting in the deaths of everyone who was on board. It is said that the trestle is still haunted by the ghosts of the passengers and crew, and that their spectral train continues to travel over the deteriorating lines, with its sad whistle resonating continuously throughout the night. I was, of course, dubious, and I dismissed it as a tall tale, a narrative told over a campfire with the intention of frightening people who were not paying attention. Jedediah's certainty, on the other hand, together with the unsettling detail that he included in his story, sowed a seed of doubt in my mind. As a result of a combination of morbid interest and curiosity, I made the decision to conduct an investigation. The night that I arrived to Carter Creek Trestle was chilly, and there was no moon. It was a melancholy wail that reverberated through the skeleton framework of the trestle as the wind howled through the ravine. The only sounds that could be heard inside the quiet were the rustling of the leaves and the hooting of an owl in the distance. The air was heavy with the aroma of pine and the moist dirt. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the deteriorating rails that extended over the trestle as I stood at the brink of the gully. When seen in its entirety, the trestle was a frightening sight, with its rusty steel girders soaring upwards into the heavens and its timber planks distorted and rotting with the passage of time. The idea that anything, much alone a train, could go through such a rickety construction seemed to be completely implausible. While I was standing there and listening to the wind, I became aware of a low rumbling sound that was coming from a distance. I could feel the earth under my feet starting to tremble as the sound became louder and closer. My pulse was beating in my chest as I flashed my flashlight down the rails towards the tracks. In addition, a train was seen coming out of the shadows at that moment. The headlight of the steam train projected an eerie glow on the rails in front of it, and the locomotive itself was an antique steam engine. Its black metal shone brightly in the dim moonlight. The train carriages that came next were old, with windows that were dark and vacant, and paint that was flaking and fading away. The wheels of the train floated freely over the deteriorating rails as it proceeded slowly and quietly over the lines. I stared in utter bewilderment, my mind attempting to make sense of what it was that I was contemplating. This is the ghost train. Yes, that was true. I was able to hear a sorrowful whistle, a long, drawn-out lament that reverberated across the canyon as the train reached the bridge. A disturbing reminder of the awful destiny of those who had died on the trestle decades ago. The sound sent chills down my spine and brought back memories of the accident. As the train made its way over the trestle, the spectral presence of the railroad filled the atmosphere with a feeling of melancholy and hopelessness. As soon as it crossed over to the other side, it gradually disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a sorrowful whistle that reverberated in the distance. With my head still whirling from the terrifying experience, I stood there for a considerable amount of time. This is the ghost train, a spectral reminder of the lives who were taken on that awful night, a tribute to the lasting power of sorrow. After that night, I went back to Carter Creek Trestle on many occasions in the hopes of catching another sight of the ghost train. But I never saw it again after that. The trestle continued to be quiet, its deteriorating structure serving as a solitary memorial to a tragedy that had been forgotten. Nevertheless, whenever I hear the sound of a train whistle in the distance, I can't help but think of the phantom train of Carter Creek Trestle and the ghostly passengers and crew who still traverse its deteriorating tracks. Their mournful cries echo through the night, serving as a chilling reminder of the precarious nature of life and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. Story 14. The Manor of Blackwood. A magnificent Gothic palace that is tucked away in the depths of the bayou in Louisiana. a location that is characterized by suffocating humidity, Spanish moss that is draped like haunting shrouds, and a sinister vibe that pervades every inch of its deteriorating building. My choice to spend a summer there refurbishing the house was one that I would soon come to regret. I had inherited the manor from a distant uncle, a guy whom I had never seen before. The house had been deserted for a considerable amount of time, and its once grand rooms were now covered in dust and cobwebs. The furniture was wrapped in white sheets, and the air was heavy with the odor of mildew and rot. An aura of discomfort was generated by the stifling humidity, the continual drone of cicadas, and the eerie quiet that hung thick in the air. This environment created a feeling of foreboding that clung to me like the Spanish moss that clung to the old oak trees that surrounded the house. Almost immediately after I arrived, I became aware of a presence inside the mansion. It was not a spectral person or a ghostly apparition, rather, it was something far more mysterious and sneaky. It seemed as if the walls of the home were emitting a terrible energy, a dark power that seemed to radiate from them. It began in a stealthy manner, with lights flickering, drafts that could not be explained, and a subtle odor of sulfur carried through the air. Subsequently, the episodes became much more unsettling. There were things that moved on their own, disembodied voices that reverberated through the corridors, and a terrible sensation of being watched, of being encircled by eyes that were not visible to the human sight. During the course of my work at the library one evening, I became aware of a noise, the sound of a deep, guttural snarl that seemed to originate from the fireplace. I moved closer to the fireplace with caution, the beam of light from my flashlight lighting the otherwise black interior. I was able to see it when I peeked inside. Looking back at me from the depths of the fireplace were a pair of eyes that were burning red and stared at me. A shudder ran down my back when the eyes blinked, and their malicious glare sent a chill down my spine. My mind was having a hard time making sense of what I had just seen, and my heart was hammering in my chest. I lurched backwards. I made an effort to justify the situation by telling myself that it was nothing more than an animal, such as a possum or a raccoon, that had strayed up the chimney. On the other hand, the eyes, with their unearthly brilliance and their insidious intensity, continued to plague my thoughts. I was unable to escape the impression that I had seen something that was far more ominous, something that defied the laws of this planet. There was a continuation of the episodes, which became more regular and more upsetting. When I awoke in the middle of the night, I would discover that the doors were open, the furniture had been moved, and the air was heavy with the odor of sulfur. I would hear footsteps reverberating through the hallways, voices that were not my own calling my name, and the eerie laughing of children coming from the nursery that was vacant. The resounding crash that I heard one night jolted me awake. I quickly leaped out of bed, grabbed my torch, and made a beeline toward the location where the sounds was coming from. It seemed as if it had originated from the dining room. In the moment when I carefully entered the room, the beam of light from my flashlight highlighted a scene of mayhem. The chandelier was hanging from the ceiling in a perilous manner. The table was flipped over, and the chairs were dispersed here and there. There was a person that was standing in the middle of the room. Despite its height, it was shrouded in darkness, and its characteristics were disguised by the gloom. There was a distinct sensation of evil that permeated the space all around it, and it exuded an atmosphere of malevolence. I had a surge of panic that washed over me, a fear that was so fundamental that it rendered me unable to move. The creature slowly turned towards me, its eyes fixated on mine even though they were not visible. I yelled as I turned and ran into the darkness corridors, my flashlight beam twirling wildly in the shadows. I was staggering down the hallways. The only time I stopped running was when I reached the front door, at which point I broke out of the mansion and into the suffocating night air. I did not go back to Blackwood Manor at any point. It is impossible to forget the brilliant red eyes and the shadowy figure that was in the dining room. The image is too clear and too unpleasant. I left the mansion, leaving its malicious spirit to fester in the bayou in Louisiana. It was a terrifying reminder of the darkness that waits in the shadows, ready to devour any who dare to disturb its sleep. I abandoned the manor. Story 15. Mary Celeste is the name. A name that has been passed down through the annals of maritime history, a representation of the unknown and the mysterious. It was in the year 1872 that a brigantine was discovered drifting and abandoned in the Atlantic Ocean. The crew of the ship disappeared without a trace, and its cargo remained unaltered. The fate of the ship has been a haunting mystery that has fascinated the globe for years. As a result of my obsession with the Mary Celeste, I decided to participate in a research trip to the Azores, which is the location where the ship was last seen. It was in the middle of the wide expanse of the ocean that I came face to face with the ghostly seamen who continue to haunt her decks. Dr. Alistair Finch, a well-known maritime historian, was in charge of the expedition. He was a guy who was concerned with discovering the truth behind the loss of the Mary Celeste. We embarked on a journey on board a research vessel that was outfitted with cutting-edge sonar and underwater exploration gear. Our goal was to find the wreck and solve the enigma that had been puzzling specialists for many years. Our quest yielded nothing but anger and sadness as the weeks went into months, until it was finally over. The ocean, which was large and merciless, kept its secrets close to its chest. At precisely the moment when we were ready to give up on our hunt, the sonar picked up a peculiarity on the ocean floor. A gigantic item that is underwater, having proportions that are comparable to those of the Mary Celeste. When we were getting ready to deploy a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, to explore the accident, the crew was filled with excitement. During the descent into the depths, the remotely operated vehicle, ROV, sent live footage back to the research vessel via its cameras. A collective gasp could be heard around the control room as the visuals began to come into focus. It turned out to be the Mary Celeste. Its masts were shattered and bent, its decks were hauntingly quiet and empty, and its hull was covered with marine vegetation at many points. During the time when the ROV was exploring the innards of the ship, we saw a terrifying scene. Their personal things were remained in their original locations, and the crew's quarters had not been touched. The food was not yet consumed, and the galley table was prepared for a dinner. There was a sudden interruption in the middle of the phrase in the captain's logbook, which was open and lying on his desk. It seemed as if the team had disappeared, as if they had not been there. We then caught a glimpse of them as the ROV made its way inside the ship's cargo hold. The sailors who have vanished. As they went stealthily throughout the hold, their ghostly hands seemed to be moving the cargo. Their bodies were transparent, and their faces were vague. Their cheeks were pale and haggard, and their eyes were sunken and filled with an indescribable grief. They were clothed in the costume of seamen from the 19th century. We stood there in startled stillness, our brains attempting to make sense of the ethereal characters that were playing out in front of us. A faint expression of disbelief appeared on Dr. Finch's face as he mumbled, "They're still here. I am ensnared, never to be separated from the vessel." The remotely operated vehicle ROV resumed its investigation, and its cameras continued to capture the ghostly sailors as they passed through the ship. They seemed to be unaware of our presence, as if they were immersed in their own world. Their acts were a reflection of the activities that they had carried out in their previous life on Earth. We saw them lifting sails, cleaning the decks and operating the helm, and their spectral actions were hauntingly coordinated with the repetitive cracking of the ship's timbers. When the remotely operated vehicle, ROV, returned to the surface, the ghostly seamen vanished into the depths of the ocean, leaving behind nothing but blackness. Our imaginations were filled with the terrible pictures of the ghostly crew as we made our way back to port, and our comprehension of the fate of the Mary Celeste was no closer to being answered. A group of ghostly seamen that were aboard the Mary Celeste. It is a haunting reminder of the secrets that are hidden under the waters, of the lives that were lost at sea, and of the souls that remain. Permanently connected to the ships that brought them to their watery deaths, there is still a mystery surrounding the ship known as the Mary Celeste, and her demise is a terrible illustration of the unpredictability of the ocean and the persistent force of the unknown.